Okay, so this topic 2.1, the cell theory, is the first topic of the Unit 2, cells. So to begin talking about the cell theory, we have to talk about the principles of the cell theory. The first of these principles is that cells are the smallest unit of life. What does this mean? It means that when you break down a living organism into the smallest component, the smallest that you can get is a cell. You can break down a cell into the components like organelles, like the nucleus or the Golgi apparatus or the mitochondria, etc. But these organelles cannot survive independently. So nothing that is smaller than a cell can survive independently. Also, organelles are meant to carry out various metabolic functions inside of the cell. Like, for example, the mitochondria produces ATP that is used as energy inside of the cell, but the mitochondria by itself outside of the cell is not able to survive. You can see here pictures of cheek cells that have been obtained from the inside section of somebody's mouth. And then here you can see onion cells, which have been colored in order for us to be able to see the nucleus and the membrane, the cell wall, very clearly. The second of the principles of the cell theory is that all organisms are composed of one or more cells. This means when you talk about multicellular organisms like ourselves, for example, multicellular organisms have specialized cells to carry out specific functions. For example, if you think about the human heart is made out of muscle cells, and the job of the muscle cells is to contract to provide the movement of the heart. It also has nerve cells that are there to transmit the electric signal that is going to tell these muscle cells to contract. So each of these cells have a specific job, but by working together, they are able to give life to a multicellular organism. Now, in the case of multicellular organisms, even though they may be microscopically small, like you can see here in the picture of the multicellular cyanobacteria, these cells, although they don't perform a lot of functions, they have to be able to communicate with each other so that by performing different functions, they can all coordinate and give life to a multicellular organism. Now, as you can see on the other picture, for example, we have an E. coli bacteria. And these are very small organisms, and the smallest organisms may consist of one cell only. So these E. coli bacteria, even though they benefit from living in colonies and from living around many other bacteria around them, they are each an entity, a unit that is one cell only. The third of the principles of the cell theory is that all cells come from pre-existing cells. This means that cells have to multiply by cellular division, mitosis and meiosis in eukaryotic cells, and binary fission in prokaryotic cells like the E. coli bacteria that we just saw. New cells cannot be constructed from non-living chemical substances. Louis Pasteur, that you may know from previous years, he performed experiments to show that living organisms do not spontaneously appear. Before Louis Pasteur, the belief was that microorganisms spontaneously appeared out of nowhere, and that's what made us sick. But we now know that no living organisms spontaneously appear. We come from the division, the reproduction of our parents. Even if you are talking about a prokaryotic bacteria, they have to have a parent cell that gives life to daughter cells. You can see in the pictures here, you can see prostate cancer cells that are dividing. They are in the last stage of mitosis. So you can clearly see how these two cells are going to be two separate entities, and they both come from one pre-existing cell. Now, when we talk about the theory, we need to also talk about the evidence for the cell theory. Okay, so for the idea that all living things consist of cells, the evidence was provided by these two scientists mainly. Many more at that time, but mainly these two, Robert Hooke and Antoine van Leeuwenhoek, who were the first scientists to examine tissue with primitive microscopes. Robert Hooke was the first one to actually start calling them cells, because he observed, as you can see in the picture over there, he observed the cells that are part of a cork tree, of a cork plant. And you can see on the right a prototype of or a replica of the microscope that Antoine van Leeuwenhoek used to examine very, very, very small organisms and tissue, like muscle tissue. They were the first to give drawings of really small cells like bacteria or sperm cells and so on. And since then, since the time of Robert Hooke and all these scientists, a lot of tissue has been examined under the microscope, and every tissue that we examine, whether it be animal or plant or bacteria, etc., they are all have been found to be consisting of cells. So we can see that everything that has life has at least one cell, if not more than one cell. The idea that cells are the smallest unit of life, if we examine the evidence for it, we can see that we can perform several experiments in which cells are burst open and the various subunits are separated using a centrifuge, so you can separate the mitochondria, the chloroplast, etc., from the rest of the cell, and you can see that these subunits of the cell are not going to survive for long. All of these subunits, even though, for example, the mitochondria and the chloroplast have their own DNA, these cells are not able to survive on their own. They need the rest of the parts of the cell to be able to carry out their functions. You can see examples of the organelles over here. These are electronic photographs. The bottom ones have been colored for us to be able to see the Golgi apparatus, the endoplasmic reticulum, the mitochondrion, and the chloroplast. Okay, if you're interested in knowing more about the subunits of the cell, so the organelles and the story of the organelles, you can read more about endosymbiotic theory, which talks about how the evolution of eukaryotic bacteria may have happened, or eukaryotic cells, sorry. So if we keep on going, the idea that all cells come from pre-existing cells, if we look at the evidence, we can see that experiments can be done using material that is suitable for sustaining the growth of living cells. If all cells are killed and no cells are allowed to enter, no cells develop from the non-living material. So this is a very basic idea that was mostly developed by Louis Pasteur with his experiments. Because of his discoveries, we now have the technique that is called pasteurization. If you look at the drinks that you have in your refrigerator closely, a lot of them have been pasteurized milk, pasteurized juice, and so on. And this pasteurization consists in heating whatever liquid we have in order to kill all the microorganisms that may be present there. And by doing so, if we keep it closed from the environment, no air can enter, and therefore no bacteria are present in there. You can see that it lasts for a long time. Once you open these containers and these containers are exposed to the air, new bacteria can enter this liquid, and because you have nutrients and because you have water present, then this liquid is going to be a suitable place for organisms to grow. You can see in the picture over here, this is Pasteur's experiment with chicken broth that he stored for a year. So you can see that in the top one, the flask was left open, so this led to the growth of microorganisms. In the bottom part, you can see that the flask was closed and you could wait for a long time, and even waiting for a very long time, there was no growth of microorganisms until the flask was opened again. So if you want to know more about how we came to know about this non-spontaneous generation and all the evidence that all cells have to come from pre-existing cells, you can read more the work of Francesco Redi, Agostino Bassi, John Snow, and Louis Pasteur. So this is the end of the very first part of the cell theory, and these are the assessment statements that belong to it. So make sure that by the end of this little video, you are able to outline the cell theory. Remember that outline means to give a brief summary. Okay, and you also need to be able to discuss the evidence for the cell theory. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this video. We are going to see many more. Thank you.